Teach me about the Great Lakes. Teach me about the Great Lakes. Cha! Welcome back to Teach Me About the Great Lakes, a twice monthly podcast in which I, a Great Lakes novice, get people who are smarter and better looking than I am. I'm supposed to say harder working. But anyway, they're smarter and harder working and sometimes better looking than I am to teach me all about the Great Lakes. I am joined this week by a bout of COVID insomnia and my good friend Carolyn Foley. Carolyn, how are you?
I apparently slept better than you last night, so I'm doing great.
Yeah, I've got
Stuart.
the no sleep, lots of coffee thing going on, and it shows already. It always makes for a more interesting episode, though, when I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth.
All right, let's get to it.
Yeah, let's get to it. Right? Let's just see what happens. No, I'm actually really excited about this episode because this is a topic that comes up again and again and again, and we're going to do at least one, if not two or three or more episodes about this going forward, and that is the idea of rising lake levels. Because my understanding is, and I don't know a lot about this, but lake levels are high right now. Maybe historically high, maybe not, right?
They are historically high in many of the Laurentian Great Lakes. Yes, we will hear more about that from our guest in a minute. But yeah, it's crazy right now.
Yeah.
Docks are underwater. It's completely nuts.
No kidding. And so I'm interested to hear the extent of that. And I did a lot of work on helping people adapt to and mitigate sea level rise when I was in the Gulf South. But this is a little bit different deal. So with that, let's cue interstitial music and talk to our guest about this one. Our guest today is Dr. Adam Beckley. He is a coastal engineering outreach specialist with Wisconsin Sea Grant over in Madison. Adam, how are you?
I'm good, Stuart. Thanks for having me.
Oh, we're so happy to have you on here to talk about this really important topic that I'm completely ignorant about, and I need to get less ignorant fast for reasons that I might talk to Carolyn about later. But let's start actually the very basics. You're a coastal engineer or a coastal engineering outreach specialist. What is coastal engineering?
So coastal engineering is really kind of building and constructing all the things along our coast. So it ranges from things like shore protection to protect buildings that are close to the coast, ports, harbors, and marinas, and something that when I say built and constructed, we might think of hard gray structures, rock and concrete, but also living shorelines, nature-based shorelines, where we're working with nature to try to protect the coast or provide habitat. Building beaches, having vegetation, and trying to work with natural features to help keep our coasts healthy and strong.
So you mentioned beaches. Is there also like wetlands or things like that? Do you ever build those?
Yeah, those would sometimes fall under coastal engineering. I don't have a lot of experience with that, but definitely trying to do coastal wetland restoration, you may need to sort of have a hybrid approach where you have some hard elements to protect from waves while you have the wetland vegetation being able to establish behind it. So there's definitely that hybrid approach in a lot of cases.
And so when you talk about protecting the coast, what you're really talking about is, let me ask, are you really talking about like you're protecting, where people live specifically, right? It's not so much the nature that needs protecting as much as it's human development. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Our coasts have been here for much longer than we have. And in the Great Lakes, they naturally erode and flood. And it's, I guess, for trees and other vegetation, it can be a problem if you fall in the lake. But, that's what nature is intended to do. We've sort of staked ourselves down along the coast because of economic reasons to ship. A lot of communities were built along the coast for that reason, and they're really pleasant places to live. But unfortunately, those natural processes, I guess not unfortunately, but in reality, those natural processes still happen, and so erosion and flooding still comes calling for that infrastructure, buildings, businesses that we've put on the coast. So sort of trying to keep those out of harm's way or figuring out a way to live with it.
And so you have a PhD in this, right? And so I was looking up your CV and I didn't understand most of the words. And so what do you study exactly? I saw something called, I can't even pronounce the word. Is it a meteor tsunami? Is that
Yeah,
even
you
right?
pronounced that right. Yeah,
Oh,
so
nailed it. Yeah.
when I was a grad student, did my dissertation on meteor tsunamis in the Great Lakes. So meteor tsunami, it's definitely a more common term than when I started studying it. But essentially what a meteor tsunami is it's a contraction of meteorological tsunami. And so what these are rapid changes in the water level of a few feet over a few minutes that are caused by storms that are moving over the lakes. So that's where the meteorological component comes in. So basically what happens is the wind and the air pressure changes that come with certain types of thunderstorms, if the thunderstorm is moving at the same speed that a large wave would move in the middle of the lake, that storm essentially sits on top of the wave, constantly pumping energy into it and growing it. So you can kind of amplify this tsunami-like wave coming across the lakes to be handful of feet once it hits the coast. Up to like 10, 15 feet have been reported around the Great Lakes.
Oh my gosh. And you said that happens within the span of a few minutes, that it goes up like
several feet. The time scale ranges, but tsunamis typically occur in that minutes to a few hours time span. And so these occur on that same time span. So, we've seen a handful of minutes up to 90 minutes. But yeah, it's a pretty rapid water level change when we're considering what typically we're used to on the Great Lakes. And a term some people might be more familiar with is seiche. And that's definitely something that happens on the Great Lakes when water sloshes back and forth like in a bathtub. Right. And so that's really, really most notably on Lake Erie between Toledo and Buffalo. They get pretty big ones. Meteor tsunamis happen a little bit faster than a seiche, whereas if you were looking at it at the lake from space, you'd actually see sort of this wave propagating across the lake. Whereas a seiche, you kind of just see that sloshing back and forth, up and down at the edges.
And for listeners who are interested in learning a little bit more about seiches, I encourage you to visit teachmeaboutthegreatlakes.com/17 and listen to episode 17 with Meg Dotson of the National Weather Service. That episode is called Flip, Float, and Follow. So interesting. So then within a matter of minutes, I'm going to derail us, and I apologize for this, but so within a matter of minutes, like a small tsunami can occur, and then those go to the shoreline and potentially harm property and people and stuff like that? Do they have like a warning system, or is it just kind of your hosed?
So far, there's not a whole lot of warning. We can kind of maybe as we see a storm kind of get the feeling of this is moving at the right speed. But in terms of like a coordinated warning system, we don't really have that in the Great Lakes. It's something that's an area of active interest in research. There are, various Weather Service offices that kind of have sort of learned experience of what types of storms might look dangerous, and they may issue a lakeshore a swimming hazard warning or something like that. But in terms of a reliable and consistent warning system, it really doesn't exist out there.
Versus like on the coast of Oregon, right, where they've got the signs everywhere and like, here's your plan.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. I'll bring us back to lake levels. So so these are instances that happen on like a shorter to longer time scale that you're talking about, where the water level might go up and down. But in recent times, the Great Lakes have been experiencing just kind of consistent high water levels, correct, right? So what's causing that?
So water levels in the Great Lakes are really kind of controlled by three things. It's essentially the supply of water into the lakes. And that is kind of summed up as net basin supply. And that is a term that sort of encompasses all the water entering and leaving the lakes kind of from the atmosphere. So that's precipitation directly onto the lake surface, runoff from the watershed into the lakes, and then evaporation of water off of the water surface. And those are, depending on which lake you're in, roughly on equivalent magnitudes. And so they kind of balance each other out. So when more water enters the lakes, either through precipitation and runoff than leaves through evaporation, we see that lake rise. Conversely, if we're getting less precipitation runoff and outweighed by more evaporation, the water levels go down. And so what we've seen kind of across the Great Lakes Basin is just a historically wet period of years. Looking back for the last 5 years, from the NOAA climate summary, the upper Midwest region has had the wettest 5 years in recorded history. So going back 125 years, I believe. And if you go back, that's kind of been the case for the last few years. Every 5-year period going forward has set a new record. So when you look back and say, well, 2018, was that the wettest 5 years? Well, it was in 2018, but it's not anymore because we keep breaking that record. So that's kind of primarily why we've seen water levels across the basin just kind of march upward in the last 7-8 years. And evaporation really hasn't been too out of whack. So when we have really high precipitation, that just kind of takes over and fills up our lake basins.
So even the increased temperatures and things like that aren't enough to kind of overcome the extra water coming in?
Well, so evaporation is kind of a funny thing, whereas we would think normally hot summer weather will get a lot of evaporation, but really the conditions where we get most of our evaporation are prime in the fall and winter months. So, for example, in Lake Michigan and Huron, we see evaporation peak out in, let's see, what month? In December, on average. We see the highest evaporation in December. And that's because of the main components we need for evaporation in the Great Lakes are warm water temperatures, but we need a differential in temperature between the air and the water. So cold air temperatures versus that warm water surface. And then low humidity, which we get in the winter, and then high wind speeds to kind of move that humid air off the lake. And so really we see, I think if we have warmer water temperatures consistently, we'll get higher evaporation, but it's really winter where we see the evaporation.
So I just want to point out that because people can't see that we can see each other, Adam was actually just looking up when these happen. So Adam, what is it that you're looking at right now? What data are you looking at?
I was looking at some NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory data where they are sort of with the Army Corps and some partners in Canada, keepers of the water level data on the Great Lakes. And so I was looking up sort of long-term averages of that net basin supply that I talked about. So sort of long-term averages of runoff, precipitation, evaporation, and then kind of how those balance out, kind of like a checking account. And so that was just sort of the monthly look at all those numbers.
And we'll put a link to that in the show notes at teachmeaboutthegreatlakes.com/2020 because this is episode 20.
Exactly. So that everybody can also geek out over graphs if they want.
GOOG, the old Goog. Yeah. How long have we been on this upward trend in lake levels? Because when I did my postdoc here at West Lafayette in 2013, we're in the middle of this huge drought, right? And then it seems like this year is pretty droughty as well, although I haven't really been tracking it, I'll be honest. It might just be my garden stunk this year. Pardon me. And so is this kind of in the last year? But you're saying that it's really wet too. So is it wet enough in the non-drought years to make up for it? Or is it just 2012 and 13 were anomalous and it's been overall wet beyond that?
Well, so 2012, 2013, we in Lake Michigan set an all-time low water level in January of 2013. And that was not necessarily because 2012 and 2013, we actually had a period over a decade of below average water levels. So the conversation then was, are the water levels ever going to go back up? So that was sort of consistent, cumulative effect of being low. And then I think, a couple dry years kind of pushed it to that record low. And then since January 2013, the lakes have just sort of gone up. At least, Lake Michigan, Huron has pretty consistently gone up.
But so this is something that...
Go ahead.
Well, this is something that changes fairly rapidly on geologic terms, right? Unlike sea level rise, for example, which is it's going to go up for kind of the foreseeable future. lake levels can change on on a couple year basis, I suppose.
Yeah, we won't go. So we're close to record highs now. We won't go back down to average next year. It takes a few years to kind of get from the extremes back to the middle. But yeah, pretty geologic timescales. Yeah, pretty darn rapid.
So when you're talking about lake levels, and you're saying, on Lake Michigan, Huron, which, Lake Superior, that is the biggest lake when you put them together. But so there's a couple of different points that water levels are sort of controlled in the Great Lakes, right? Where are those, and who sort of is responsible for controlling those?
The term control has to be, we don't have full control over the water levels. In fact, we have, I think whenever the Army Corps presents on this, they say, Mother Nature controls feet and humans control inches. So we do have some hydraulic structures where we can kind of change how much water is flowing between the lakes, and in some cases, diversions in and out of the lake. So the main ones are the out of Lake Superior into Lake Huron, Michigan, is controlled by the St. Mary's Dam, the compensating works. That kind of controls how much water is being let out of Lake Superior. And then again, there's not another dam that controls flow between the lakes until the Mose-Saunders Dam that is lets water out of the St. Lawrence Seaway, sort of out of Lake Ontario and then out into the ocean. And so there are kind of those two control points, and then there are some diversions that either go in or out of the lakes. And so one main one that people are probably familiar with is the Chicago River, that was reversed back in in 1900 when it was completed. And so I have a couple numbers for that just to put things in perspective. There's about 3,200 cubic feet per second of water going out of Lake Michigan through the Chicago River and out into the Mississippi River Basin. So over the course of an entire year, that is 750 billion gallons of water, which sounds like a lot. That only amounts to about an inch of water out of Lake Michigan Huron when you average that across the water surface.
Over the whole.
So when they say Mother Nature controls feet and humans control inches, that's one example.
So thinking about the drivers here, I want to focus on that again for a second. So it seems to be mainly this net. Hang on, let me get the term right. Net basin supply, and when that's when you have more supply than or when that's higher, I guess you get the higher lake levels. And so when I think about sea level rise, you think about things like thermal expansion, right? The idea that water expands as it gets warmer, and that's a pretty significant driver. My understanding is of sea level. Once you get on like the ocean scale, even just a little bit of expansion means a fair amount of growth in terms of the relative sea level. Is thermal expansion is there a climate story generally when it comes to lake level rise, or is it just happening for other reasons that aren't necessarily climate related?
Well, I think it's not as direct of a story as sea level rise because we don't have any glaciers in the Great Lakes Basin, and Lake Ontario is about 250 feet above sea level. So if the Great Lakes start getting sea level rise, then we're in a world of hurt because that means sea levels are up 250 feet. So thermal expansion, I'm not super familiar with that's impact in the Great Lakes, but it would definitely be less in the Great Lakes just because the oceans are miles deep, whereas the Great Lakes are their deepest over 1,000 feet. But so it won't be as much water kind of expanding, so it won't have as much of a net effect. But there is sort of a climate story in that those net basin supply components are definitely shifting. Precipitation under climate change, we're expected to see a wetter climate. So we can expect more precipitation. But then on the flip side, with warmer temperatures, we may expect more evaporation because we can have, warmer lake temperatures in the winter to drive more evaporation. Previously, the sort of science and the modeling predicted a potential trend downward in lake levels, but recent kind of corrections to how evaporation is treated have kind of muddied the waters. We're not 100% sure. There's not really a clear trend whether long-term lake levels go upward or downward, but there's anticipating some of those swings might be more extreme. We may see higher highs and lower lows just because we may expect more extremes in precipitation and in drought. And certainly, seeing record 5-year precipitation for the past 3 or 4 years could be an indication of differences in the climate.
So one thing I'd like to do is sort of we're talking about lake levels. They're very high now, and they will be for a bit, and then they may get lower, they may not. And this is sort of going to be something that is a feature, I guess, going forward of living in the Great Lakes area. So I imagine a lot of your work with Wisconsin Sea Grant is working with governments to help adapt, I guess, to lake levels, higher lake levels now and potentially lower ones in the future. What is the work that you're doing there, and what can local governments do to help prep for this?
Yeah, so I do spend a lot of time with Wisconsin communities to try and figure out what their path forward is, how to respond, and how to think for the future to be resilient to these changes. And there's not a one size fits all solution. It really is dependent on sort of what's at risk and sort of how much money is available and what some of the options are. There's sort of, for, I guess, usually I recommend kind of prioritizing. Okay, what's critical? What is imminently at risk, and what's critical and really needs to be planned for future effects. And so, there's for things that can't move, things that need to stay functional, things that are vital to the community. There's the sort of defend option or add some coastal protection or beef them up.
And so those would be things like who knows what, but critical infrastructure, buildings, roads, hospitals, stuff like that. Is that kind of what you mean?
Water treatment plants, wastewater and drinking water, those are right on the Great Lakes. Yeah. And so those are critical and by nature in sort of a hazardous area. So, so there's that option. And that's often a first thought for a lot of people is we've got to hold the line and fight back the waves, which is not a trivial task. Shore protection it gets constantly battered. And we have to design it big enough to handle lake levels that might be higher than right now, perhaps, large storm events. And so that's definitely has a place. And then there's also sort of a thinking and planning about the future. Maybe homes, maybe assets can be relocated. Maybe when they sort of use up their useful life, when it's time to do a major renewal, is considering if that should be relocated away from the coast, so we're not constantly fighting against the waves. That is one option.
Yeah, is there a movement now to more? I felt like when I was in Texas that people were really appreciating more the idea of designing with nature as opposed to kind of command and control, right? And so there was less, there's still plenty of focus on like hard infrastructure and seawalls and stuff like that, but we're moving more toward a living shoreline and oyster reef protection type world. Do you see that kind of in your field, or is it the kind of thing where this infrastructure is so critical that we just need to build and maintain seawalls or lake walls or whatever the right term is, even though maybe if we're designing it fresh, we would design it differently?
So there is a sort of a spectrum of incorporating nature into these sorts of designs. And on the Great Lakes, it's definitely an emerging field. It's not as well established as, say, the Gulf or the Atlantic. We don't have oysters that we can use for oyster beds, and our growing season makes things a bit tough to get, say, marsh vegetation established. So it is an expanding field where we maybe take hybrid approaches. And the open coast of the Great Lakes is you can't just get by on vegetation alone and expect to hold and protect critical assets with that. So incorporating things like living revetments where you incorporate a lot of vegetation upland can be good for habitat. Having a series of maybe some offshore breakwaters where you can have a bit more naturalized shoreline behind it, but you still are using gray infrastructure to help reduce that wave energy. like I said, it's really kind of a growing field, and we'll see a lot of changes, I think, in the coming years. And this has been an impetus. These high water levels have certainly been an impetus to try and figure out those sorts of things. So.
And so then on the individual level, we're recording this in early October. Just this morning was the first 30-something degree morning in West Lafayette. And so it's a reminder that, as Ned Stark says, winter is coming. So as the winter comes, a lot of people start to worry about the lake levels and how it might affect their homes. Are there things that people can do to prep, for the overwinter period when it comes to lake levels?
Over the winter, yeah, we definitely see our largest storms in the winter. So that's when we see a lot of our erosion and flooding. And so, really it's sort of figuring out, where do I stand? Am I at imminent risk here? How close am I to an eroding shoreline or to maybe a flood elevation? And that's not really something you can do. Just there's some cases where it's very clear the house is 10 feet off of an eroding cliff, and that's very clear something needs to be done. Other times it can be a bit more ambiguous, depending on if you're on a bluff, sort of how high the bluff is, what materials it's composed of, what the current slope is. So kind of if there's a concern about sort of an imminent risk, it's sort of getting some professional help to figure out how fast do I have to act? Okay. Is this something I got to do now? And then as we get towards winter, it's a similar set of options on a smaller scale, which is, is it something you dig in and defend and install a revetment or a seawall because erosion's that close? When that happens, again, with the example of like a bluff, you need to figure out, is the bluff stable enough? Even if you put in shore protection, that bluff may still be unstable and could potentially fail back to the house. So thinking holistically. And then also, if there's space, can you move your house? Can you relocate your house on a lot, get it away from an erosion zone or higher up from flooding area? Oftentimes staying out of the way is the most cost effective and effective overall way to deal with this. And then as we get towards winter, one thing that can be problematic specifically on bluff coasts is frost heave, where water gets in the bluff soil and then it freezes and wedges apart the bluff. So trying to manage water on these coastal sites and keep them away from eroding bluffs. For example, pointing your downspouts not towards the lake, but away from the lake, avoiding ponding and things like that. Trying to keep a bluff as dry as possible is one thing that can be
And so you mentioned
one of the easier solutions. Yeah.
You mentioned getting professional help. Does that mean like call up a coastal engineer? Call up you if they live in Wisconsin? Who is the professional in this situation?
Yeah, coastal engineers or geologists and sometimes experienced contractors can really either have a sense from looking at a site and knowing the area or be able to run those sort of calculations. And at least at Wisconsin Sea Grant, we have a list of known coastal engineers and contractors that do work in Wisconsin. They also have offices other places in the Great Lakes. I think New York Sea Grant has a similar list. And then also local zoning offices, local land management offices may or may not have some expertise because they deal with these situations a lot. So they might be able to help, and they might not have the expertise, but it's definitely worth a call to see.
Okay, great. Well, Adam, this is really interesting, and we appreciate you coming on to talk about that, but that's actually not why we invited you on Teach Me About the Great Lakes. We invited you on Teach Me About the Great Lakes to answer two questions, and the first one is this. If you could have a great donut for breakfast or a great sandwich for lunch, which one would it be?
I would go with the sandwich. I remember sandwiches, but I don't have a lot of memories of donuts. I've definitely had good donuts, but not
a lot of memorable donuts. Right? Fair enough. So then when I'm in Madison next, where should I go to get a really great sandwich?
I am partial to Stalzy's Deli, which is a short walk from my house. I am a big fan of the Reuben there.
Stalzy's Deli, great. I will put a link to that in the show notes and head there next time I'm in Madison. Now, we'd like to leave our listeners with a little bit of life advice. It can be big or little, serious or silly. It doesn't matter. Just something that they can take with them to turn around in their head as they sit there and wait 2 weeks between episodes. So, Adam, what is a piece of life advice that you have for our listeners?
I would say take time to sort of be appreciative of things in your life. And I think that, sometimes it's pertinent in this job too, because sometimes I get a little flustered. Obviously with high water levels being high, there's a lot going on. It can really be stressful, but then I step back and think that I really get to work with a lot of great people on a lot of interesting things and try and help them. And so I really appreciate that. So for me personally, it's taking that time to reflect and appreciate it.
Oh, I love it. Well, Adam, where can people go if they want to find out more about the work that you do? If they want to, do you have like a social media thing, or should they go to the Sea Grant homepage? What works for you?
We have, Wisconsin Sea Grant has our page, and then you can find coastal engineering and processes where a lot of this information is housed. We also have an ongoing project where we keep posting on monthly on Great Lakes water levels at sewicoastalresilience.org. That has water level information and more things about trying to adapt and be resilient.
And that stands for Southeast Wisconsin, I assume?
Correct.
All right. Well, we will put links to those also in the show notes. Dr. Adam Beckley, Coastal Engineering Outreach Specialist with Wisconsin Sea Grant, thank you so much for coming on and teaching us all about the Great Lakes.
Thank you. It's been great.
So lake levels, that's interesting. So it's actually a fair amount different from sea level in that it's not like this upward rise that is going to continue. It's more of a fluctuation situation.
Right, and there are so many different components that people are trying to figure out. It's we can talk some more about modeling and all the predictions that you can and cannot make right now. So it's important to gather more data.
Yep, yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Important to fund scientists to do that work, and of course, fund social scientists to help with the adaptation side. But so I thought that was really interesting. But it's another thing I realized we need to rename this podcast from "Teach Me About the Great Lakes" to like "Sad and Scared" or "Things That Are Worrying" or something like that, because it's. I feel like we've been focusing a lot lately on all the different ways in which environmental harm is coming home to roost lately. But
then you listen to what Adam's advice was, and you say, like, well, there's still good stuff out there. We're helping people. We're figuring things out. We're helping them adapt, and it'll be great.
No, you're right. Well, I mean, great or not, it'll be. But no, I think you're right. There's a lot of steps that people can take, and that's actually a significant problem. And one thing that we'll want to talk about at some point is just that. It's like, you don't want to get overwhelmed, because if I feel like I'm not just talking about the Great Lakes environment right now, but if you focus so much on bad stuff without focusing on the steps you can take to make it less bad or better, you risk getting overwhelmed, and that's not a great way to be.
Yeah, I periodically break in to always look on the bright side of life. And so if you were at my house, then that's how you would know. It's like time to start singing.
Yeah, but there's one particular line in there that you...
Life's a piece of spit is what I saw them perform for Queen Elizabeth II one time, and I remember eagerly staring at the screen, right. And then it was like,
what are they going to say?
Anyway.
Life's a piece of spit when you look at it. Yes,
exactly. All right. So the thing that I learned today, because I know you're going to ask me, I actually found it really interesting that evaporation processes in the Great Lakes are not all, he said they're not that out of whack compared with what happened. Because I've heard a lot about winter ice cover, and as that's retreating, the evaporation. But based on what Adam was saying, it seems like it's really the precipitation and the wet, which is making things go up, which I found really neat.
Yeah, I agree. And that I thought was interesting. And to me, the main thing, again, that I learned was just that this is not an up thing, but it's a fluctuation thing. And it's so I thought that was cool. And even though it wasn't the main topic, hang on, let me get it right. Meteo tsunamis I found to be both interesting and terrifying. So now I have to read a lot more about those.
There's some really, really cool stuff that people have been putting out trying to explain those that we can put links to.
Oh, really? Videos or explainer type things?
Yeah, variety of outputs. But yeah, we'll put links to a couple of them down in the bottom, and maybe we'll talk. I mean, you've mentioned them a couple times, right? In different episodes. So
Meteo tsunamis, I have?
No, maybe you haven't. Edit that out, Stuart.
No, maybe I have. Maybe I have. I don't know.
I made a bad guess.
If so, I'd forgotten about them. Oh, it's very possible. I forget about a lot of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Carolyn's part of it. It means more work.
No, that's fine. It's all good. Yeah. Well, anyway, so that's interesting, and I want to look into that, and I wonder. So my question, I mean, I didn't want to derail us, but I wonder, like, how predictable are those? Will they be predictable? I mean, it sounds really hard if it crops up that quickly. I don't, we talked about how hard it was to predict derechos. I can't imagine that these meteor tsunamis are predictable at all. But it'd be interesting to look into. So yeah, potential future episode there as well. Write it down. Great.
So what we're really doing is, like, because I haven't mentioned water spouts, but we're going to talk about water spouts at some point
really?
too. It's going to be all weather all the time.
I mean, it's weather and sadness. That's the episode. Yeah, water spouts are great though. I used to go fishing out on the Gulf with my dad, and we would sometimes see water spouts and drive the other way in the boat. But they're really amazing things. So yeah, we'll do water spouts. But I think we need to find an episode full of happy talk. So I'm going to work on that for the next few weeks. Maybe not next episode because of what we had planned, but maybe a couple episodes after that. We'll see. But we always want to be happy on Teach Me About the Great Lakes, so I'll do what I can. Anyway.
We make bad jokes.
What's the bad joke?
No, I was going to say we can make bad jokes.
Oh, yeah, we can make bad. I mean, you can. I've never made a bad joke. But sure.
Yeah.
Anyway, I encourage you all to follow us on all of the social media. So you should run out right now to your phone or your computer web browser or your tablet and go to www.twitter.com/ILIN Sea Grant to follow Illinois Indiana Sea Grant's main feed. You can follow the show itself on Teach Great Lakes on Twitter. And Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, we're on all the social media at ILIN Sea Grant. So if you don't like that, maybe you like Facebook, do the Facebook. There's probably more social media, so do those too.
Yeah, or you can send emails. Or, some people actually do still receive letters as well. Like,
very interesting. Yeah, write us a letter. Actually, I would love that. Send us a card, write us a letter. It won't arrive until I get back in the office next year, probably, but it'll be a nice little treat. So you can send that 195 Marsteller, West Lafayette, Indiana, 47907. And we look forward to receiving that in a year. Well, anyway, thank you so much for listening. We appreciate it. Make sure you do the likes and the subscribes. Tell all your friends about us. And we will see you on the first Monday of every month and the third Monday of most months. And until then, keep grading those lakes. Awesome.
Always look on the right side of death. Sorry.
Just before you draw your terminal breath. Oh, God. Don't hold your computer, really. I don't want to be responsible for your forearm. No. We're far south of that.
This is going to be in, right?
Yeah. This may be at the end. Yeah.